Well, listen, when I say the words press pause, what comes to your mind? Probably a little image of a triangle turned sideways and two little vertical lines, right? I would dare say that's probably, for the majority of you, you see something like that. You're thinking of an audio device. Somebody dated themselves over here and said VCR. I'm not going to say who, but somebody over here. Some people are saying, a what? A VCR? So, yeah. For you kids, it was this device we used back in the good old days, all right? But anyway, you're seeing an audio device, some type of an audio player, something like that you can press pause on. And, a pause button is really there for a couple of reasons. One, it's good to have that pause button for when we're at a really good part of a song or a podcast or a movie, and someone comes in and interrupts us, and we can press pause so that we don't miss anything or lose our spot where we're at, right? It's good to have that pause button for that moment. Or another reason is when someone comes in or something else comes up, we can press pause because there's something else of greater importance that comes up. And we need to listen or maybe step away because something more urgent has come up, and we can come back to this later, right? So, how many of you are willing to admit this? Maybe you are on a road trip and you're going to a destination that you've never been to before, and you're following directions. Maybe you're old school and you still write directions down on a sheet of paper, or maybe you have pulled it up on your smartphone and you're listening to Siri, or you have a GPS device and you're just listening to your directions, and it's getting to a series of several turns in a row, or you've just missed a turn. And now you're confused and rerouting. I know you're rerouting, but hurry, and you're getting. So what do we tend to do? And I say we because I'm guilty of the same thing. We turn the music down or off so we can hear the directions or focus better, right? I don't know why we do that, but we do, right? Anybody else willing to admit that with me? Am I the only? Okay, good. I'm in good company here. I don't know why we do it, but we do. So press pause. If you haven't figured it out, that's what I want to talk to you about tonight is press pause. We're in this series, The Interview, where we are journeying through the book of Mark. And it's my privilege to get to speak to you tonight from the last part of chapter 2, or leading into the first part of chapter number 3. And when I say that it's my privilege, it truly is my privilege to get to share with you tonight. And I just want to thank Pastor Roy for trusting myself and our team to fill the pulpit in his absence while he's on this sabbatical. I know they don't mind me speaking on their behalf, but we truly do not take this for granted, and we do not take this responsibility lightly. And I just want to thank him for allowing us this privilege. But if you were here about 3 weeks ago, I believe it was, that Pastor Michael was in Mark chapter 1 and verse 38, which reads, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And I go back to this reference because it really is a good springboard for the next couple of sermons that has been brought out, and then even where we're going tonight. And from that verse, Pastor Michael asked this question. He said, would you rather attend a church that sees miracles every Sunday, or a church that has good sound preaching and messages every Sunday? It's a good question. Personally, I'm looking for the one that serves really good barbecue after every service. Amen. Anybody with me on that? But seriously, it is a good question to ask yourself and to consider. And then Pastor Caleb last week, he brought us into a little bit of a different section here in the book of Mark, because now we're in a part of the Gospel of Mark where the Pharisees, now they're beginning to really question Jesus and his disciples. Now they're looking and they're questioning the company that Jesus is keeping, and they're questioning even why his disciples are not fasting like the disciples of John and even some of the disciples of other Pharisees. And as Caleb put it last week, they were choosing traditions over truth. And Jesus' response to their questioning was, he gave them a visual illustration that they would all be familiar with, that you don't put new wine into old wineskins. See, Jesus did not come to patch up the old religious Judaism with its rules and traditions. That's not why he was here. His purpose was to fulfill it and to start something new. See, Jesus Christ, God's Son, came to earth to offer people forgiveness of sins and reconciliation with God. That was his purpose of coming here. This, the good news, did not fit in with the old, rigid, legalistic system of religion. It needed a fresh start, and that's why Jesus came. Matter of fact, if social media had existed back then, I believe Jesus's @ symbol would have been fresh start, just because he was bringing a fresh start to everything. And I think the message that Jesus was bringing, listen, the message will always remain new in a sense because it must be accepted and applied in every generation. When you follow Jesus, you might as well be prepared for new ways to live, new ways to look at people, new ways even to serve. And the Pharisees, well, they had become rigid like the old wineskins, and they couldn't accept faith in Jesus that would not be contained or limited by this human-made ideas or rules. And so the message that Jesus was teaching them, that he has come to fulfill the law and start something new, well, it only caused their hatred of him to grow even more and more and more, and it got even more intense, as we'll see in our text tonight. So let's turn to Mark chapter 2, and we're going to pick up in verse number 23. Now, we've been encouraging you to bring a physical copy of the Bible with you, and I hope you're doing that. There's nothing wrong with digital copies, but I tell our kids, and even as a youth pastor for all those years, I encourage our students, I encourage our kids, bring a physical copy. Why? Listen, I use a digital copy too, so don't think I'm against it. There's distractions, right? I mean, your text messages pop up, emails pop up. That doesn't happen here, okay? So let's just kind of remove some of the distractions and follow along here, okay? That's why we kind of still like old school methods every now and then, all right? So Mark chapter 2, verse 23. We'll begin reading there. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So now we go to chapter 3, verse 1. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. Now just take a moment here. Please note, it doesn't say he was born this way. A lot of times when you're reading scripture and Jesus comes to a person who has some type of disability of some kind, you'll hear the phrase, he or she was this way from birth. Now, it doesn't say this with this particular man. And so some of the commentaries that I was reading and studying, some scholars believe that earlier translations, it was that this man perhaps had an injury later in life that caused his hand to be withered. And while his situation, his withered hand was not physically causing him a life or death situation, it was preventing him from being able to work and provide for his family. thus creating a life or death situation, so to speak. He couldn't provide for his family. And so that was the man's need. So I just found that to be interesting. Verse 2 says, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with a withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger. See, Jesus was angry about their uncaring attitudes. See, anger itself isn't wrong. It's what makes anger wrong depends on what makes us angry and what we do when we feel it. All right? Too often we express our anger in selfish and harmful ways. By contrast, Jesus expressed his anger by correcting a problem. He healed a man's hand, all right? So that's the difference. But regardless, he looked around at them with anger, verse 5, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now, these two Sabbath scenes make a climax to the incidents that Pastor Caleb spoke about last week. Because last week, Jesus asserted his right to kind of brush aside the rabbinical ordinances about eating with sinners and about fasting. But here he really goes against the grain here. He goes a lot further because now he's claiming power over the divine ordinance of the Sabbath. And so now the Pharisees, you want to talk about somebody that's triggered? These Pharisees are now triggered to murderous hate by these two incidences. So let me just go back to our text. Let me try to go through this and explain some of this, and then we'll get into the message, all right? So let me just kind of clarify one thing up front, because as I was studying this and reading this, I never really personally found this to be an issue, but as I was reading this, I was kind of surprised that some people found this to be an issue. But let me just clarify this up front. Jesus and his disciples, when they were there picking the grain in this field, they weren't stealing. Okay? If you go back and read Leviticus chapter 19, I believe it's verses 9 and 10, and then if you read Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, these verses legislated that farmers were to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that some of their crops could be picked by travelers or by the poor. So just like walking on a sidewalk through private property isn't trespassing, well, picking heads of grain at the edge of a field wasn't stealing, okay? So just clarify that if there was any questioning this. So here we find Jesus once again cutting right across the scribal rules and regulations here, and he and his disciples were going through the fields on this particular Sabbath. And his disciples began to pluck the grain and eat it. And on any other day, any other ordinary day, what they were doing, it was perfectly permissible. But this, dun, 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 this was the Sabbath. This was the Sabbath. And you don't do that on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was hedged around with literally thousands of petty rules and regulations. Now, I do think that it's worth noting, Jesus, he didn't avail himself of the distinction between God's commandment and men's interpretation of it. See, here, what I think is interesting, here, he allows their assumption of the equal authority of their commentary and the text, both of them, to go unchallenged. Matter of fact, he accepts their statements that his disciples really were going against the law. Yeah, they were doing what the law says they're not supposed to do. But then he justifies their breach of the law. Let me clarify this. Exodus 34:21 is where you find the law. God's law said that crops should not be harvested on the Sabbath. This law was put in place, though, for a reason. The law prevented farmers from becoming greedy and ignoring God on the Sabbath. And it also protected laborers from being overworked. The Pharisees now interpreted the actions of Jesus' disciples, them picking and eating the grain, as they walked through this field. They interpreted that as harvesting, and so they said, Jesus, you're a lawbreaker. But Jesus and the disciples, they clearly weren't picking grain for gain. They were simply looking for something to eat. All right? And the Pharisees, catch this, the Pharisees were so focused on the words of the rules that they missed the intent. Amen. See, the rule was in place to keep farmers from becoming greedy and ignoring God on the Sabbath. Nowhere does it imply that you cannot pick something to eat. So they were so focused on words that they missed this intent. Jesus wasn't out there breaking rules. They weren't out there doing anything wrong. They were just trying to grab a little bit of a snack on the way. When the Pharisees, though, launched their accusations and pointed out that Jesus' disciples were breaking the law, I'm sure the Pharisees first thought, well, when we call them out, they're just going to stop on the spot. That was probably their expectation. But Jesus instead turns around and answers them in language they would understand. He uses the example of David, and it's a story that you find in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And he uses this story of David to point out just how ridiculous the Pharisees were being with these accusations. In the story that Jesus refers to here of David, shock, was fleeing for his life. That seems like how we read most of David's life, right? Always fleeing for his life. But he came to the tabernacle in Nob, and he demanded food, and there was none there other than the showbread. And these sacred loaves of bread that was there, they were set before God on this table in the place, in the holy place there in the tabernacle. And what would happen is they would put the bread there, and on the Sabbath, they would replace it with 12 fresh baked loaves of bread, and the old bread would then be given to the priest, and it was for the priest and him only for consumption. But when David came there and in his time of need, he took and he ate that bread. And so Jesus showed that Scripture itself supplies a precedence in which human need took precedence over human and even divine law. So that's why Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now look, this is something I'm going to speak on a little bit later, but I want to go ahead and say it now. God created the Sabbath for our benefit. God created the Sabbath for our benefit. We are restored both physically and spiritually when we take time to rest and focus on God. Amen. Okay? The Pharisees couldn't grab hold of this. They were more focused on words, not intent. For the Pharisees, Sabbath rules had become more important than Sabbath rest. So, I think if we could put it in how it might look today, if Pharisees were around today, it might look like this. They would be more focused on the style of music than the message of the song. They would be more focused on their traditions and their traditional methods than they would be the hundreds of next generation kids and students that are being reached with the gospel through out-of-the-box methods, even though the message was and is the same. Okay? So I'm just trying to say that's what happens when we get focused on words, not intent. When we kind of get out of that, all right? So both David and Jesus understood that the intent of God's law is to promote love for God and others. See, the Christian faith involves a lot of rules that are meant to be governed by love, and that makes love the highest rule. But it also means that it moves Christians towards more personal sacrifice. It moves us towards more discipline, more responsibility. And let's just admit it, those are scarce resources in today's culture. But then we come to chapter 3, and this is a crucial incident in the life of Jesus. I mean, already many of the religious leaders had turned against Jesus and become his enemies. And they were jealous of his popularity, they were jealous of his miracles, and the authority of his teaching and his actions, and they valued their status in the community and their opportunity for personal gain so much that they lost sight of what that should have been their goal from the very beginning as religious leaders, and that's pointing people towards God. That should have been their goal all along. They were the religious leaders. Now, let me just take a side note here, okay? I cannot thank this church enough that you want to provide for me and my family and take care of me. I am so grateful. You have no idea how grateful I am for that. And I am blessed beyond, I'm humbled by how well you take care of me and my family. That you want to provide for me so that I can live out the calling God has placed on my life. But please hear me, and hear me well. The day that it becomes more about a paycheck for me than it does about reaching people for him, somebody pull me to the side and have an intervention. Because it is never about the money. It is about reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And these religious leaders could not see that, and they didn't get that. And so here we are. Of all people, the Pharisees should have recognized the Messiah, but they refused to acknowledge him because they weren't willing to give up their treasure. They weren't willing to give up their position. They weren't willing to give up their power. So when Jesus exposed their attitudes, when that's when he became their enemy instead of their Messiah. And they began looking for ways to turn more people against him. So let me try to help you visualize the scene here. All right, my inner kids pastor may come out just a little bit here, all right? So imagine the scene. Jesus walks into the synagogue. Okay, no, it wasn't a Western saloon. But he walks into the synagogue here, all right? Which, you got to admit, that was a rather brave move for him because they hated him, all right? There was already a crowd after him. And there was a group there, not just of Pharisees, but the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the Pharisees on steroids. That's the best way I know to explain them, all right? I mean, they were the rule keepers of the rule keepers, all right? And no one could miss them because the front row seats were the seats of honor, and that's where they would sit at. And it was the duty of the Sanhedrin to deal with anyone who was likely to mislead people and to seduce them from the right way. And that is precisely what they conceived of themselves as doing. The last thing that they were there to do was to worship and learn. They were there to scrutinize Jesus' every action. And so in the synagogue is a man with a paralyzed hand. Now, Jesus could have been cautious, and he really could have conveniently pretended not to see this guy because he knew good and well this guy was going to want him to heal him. But it's the Sabbath. It's the Sabbath. I'm not supposed to heal on the Sabbath because it's the Sabbath, and no work is to be done on the Sabbath, and to heal is work, and it's the Sabbath. How am I supposed to do this? That was the rules. That was the law. Medical attention on the Sabbath could only be given if a life was in danger. That was the law. You don't believe me? Listen to some of these laws they had. A woman in childbirth might be helped on the Sabbath. An infection of the throat might be treated. If a wall fell on anyone, apparently that was a thing back then. When I was a kid, don't play in the road. A car might hit you. Back then, kids, watch out. Wall might fall on you. Be careful. Different times. So if a wall fell on anyone, enough might be cleared away to see whether a person was dead or alive. Fred! Leave him. Come back tomorrow. I don't know. How does it go? But that's what the law read. All right? A fracture could not be attended to. Cold water might not be poured on a sprained hand or foot. A cut finger might be bandaged with a plain bandage. No Scooby-Doo or Dora the Explorer Band-Aids. A plain bandage, but with no ointment. At the most, an injury could be kept from getting worse. It must not be made better. That was the law. So Jesus knew this man's life was not in danger, not in the least. Physically, he would be no worse off if he were left until the next day. For Jesus, this was a test case. And he met it fairly and squarely. And so Jesus calls this man out, and by calling him out, I mean he literally calls him out. I mean he calls him to come out in front of everyone there. Jesus wanted everyone to see this man. Why? I don't know. Maybe he was just trying to get sympathy for the guy. Or perhaps he wanted everybody there to see what was about to happen. Because Jesus turned and looked at these experts. And I love this next part. I love this next part because he asked two of the most skillfully thought out questions he could have asked in that moment. I love this. Listen to what he asked. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? Man, can you feel the tension in the room right there? Man, I love it. He just put them in a dilemma. Because you see, they had to admit that it was lawful to do good. And it really was a good thing he proposed to do. They had to deny that it was lawful to do evil. And yet it was an evil thing to leave the man crippled when it was possible to heal him. But there's the real dagger. To save life or to kill? While Jesus is taking steps to heal this man, they were plotting how to kill Jesus. And no matter how you look at it, it's a whole lot better to try to figure out how to heal and better a man's life than how to plot and kill a man's life. No wonder they had nothing to say, right? So let me try to tie all of this together and summarize why we all need to value the Sabbath and really understand what it looks like to press pause in our own lives, okay? Hopefully we have a little bit better understanding of the text, but I want to go back to the very words of Jesus there in chapter 2 where he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Do you honor the Sabbath? I mean, in today's culture, we don't give it much thought, do we? We don't give much thought to the Sabbath because, hey, we're not under the law, right? Well, yeah, but however, the idea of Sabbath was never intended to be oppressive. It was a gift from God. As our Creator, God knows how we work and what we need to be fruitful. He designed us to function best when we take a day and rest from our busyness, from all the hustle and bustle, from work, from everything. And as a part of trying to keep the Sabbath holy, which, by the way, that is the fourth commandment, the Jews had created this lengthy list of rules and regulations about what could and couldn't be done on the Sabbath. And in our text, again, the Pharisees, they're accusing Jesus and his disciples of breaking both of these rules since they were traveling and plucking the grain here just because they had the munchies, all right? These Pharisees have a view of the law and the Sabbath where people are bound to it as if it is a means unto itself, as opposed to the view that Jesus puts it in verse 27, that the Sabbath was actually created to serve people. We're not good at resting though, are we? Look, I'll confess to you, I'm not very good at resting. Now, don't ask my wife. She might have a different answer, but I don't feel like I'm very good at resting, okay? I will confess to you, when I realized I was preaching and where it landed in Scripture for me to preach, I was like, really, God? You got a good sense of humor. Because as I was preparing for this and studying this, it's been a crazy busy season of life and just going nonstop, seems like. And I'm not saying this for pity, okay? Because listen, I have nothing to complain about, and what happened is nothing compared to what many of you have gone through. But for me, I got my own little 2-day holiday, okay? Because I got to experience my first ever kidney stone, and so I got a 1-day retreat in the Trumbull Regional Resort ER, all right? And so I had my Sabbath. Don't laugh. I was calling on God, I promise you. So, yes, God taught me the hard way of it's important to rest. You can go and go and go and go, and eventually God's going to say, okay, you're going to rest. I got the message loud and clear. So none of us are good at that. For some of us, the Sabbath may look like putting the laptop or the phone down for a season and maybe going outside and planting a garden, working in the yard for a little bit. It may be reading a book. Parents, it might be good to just take a day and turn the TV off and take the kids around and just have a good family day of playing some games and going to the park. The Sabbath doesn't mean that we have to sit around and do nothing. As a matter of fact, Matthew 12:12, Jesus taught us that we should at least do good works on the Sabbath. All right? The Sabbath leads us to be intentional in planning for both our personal rest and the rest of our family. See, we function best when you and I live as we were designed to. That's the bottom line. But let me caution all of us, rest. That's only part of what the Sabbath is for. Stay with me. See, we're not created to be victims and slaves of Sabbath rules and regulations. The Sabbath, it exists to make our lives better. See, in our text, here's a couple of truths that I see from this. To the Pharisees, religion was ritual. It meant obeying certain rules and regulations. To Jesus, it was service. It was love God and love others. And while the Pharisees were zealous for God's law, their zeal was strongly rooted in preventative, behavior-based, legalistic following of the law. They loved God's law, but they did not love. Do you understand that? Jesus was standing in direct conflict of both their interpretation of the law and their attitudes. And so he did so by reaching out to those who were abused or neglected by the Pharisees while still perfectly keeping the law. It should be noted that Jesus wasn't kind of shirking the Mosaic law in any way during these conflicts, but really he was revealing the heart condition behind the Pharisees and their misinterpretation as it pertained to each conflict. The conflict comes to a head in the final confrontation, and it reveals the heart attitudes behind all of them. In Mark 3:2, the Pharisees, they're watching Jesus to see if he's going to heal somebody on the Sabbath. What kind of a heart attitude is that? And as stated earlier, working on the Sabbath, it was a crime punishable by death, but once they had witnessed the healing, they began to plot his death, which was the reason for Jesus' rhetorical question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what's good or evil, to save life or to kill? Now, the answer is obvious, but the Pharisees doubled down on their sin and quite literally carried out their results. While Jesus was doing good on the Sabbath, fulfilling the intent and spirit of the law, as well as the letter of the law itself, since he healed the man with a spoken word. He didn't really work, he just spoke, all right? The Pharisees used the Sabbath to do evil and plot Jesus' death. So Jesus' outrage and grief towards their hard-heartedness, well, it was really, it's understandable. But one of the best ways to worship God, I want you to understand this, Jesus was showing them one of the best ways to worship God and honor the Sabbath is to help people. Matthew 25:40, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. What a beautiful picture of honoring a Sabbath and worshiping God, helping people. Many of the religious leaders were so caught up in the human-made laws that they lost sight of what was good and right. And here Jesus simply suggested that the Sabbath is a day to do good. God provided the Sabbath as a day of rest and worship, but he didn't mean that the concern for rest should keep us from lifting a finger to help others. Don't allow your Sabbath to become a time of selfish indulgence. So what does that look like for us today? Well, when was the last time you pressed pause? You know what I mean by that, right? Again, to our opening visual illustration. When you press pause on an audio player, it's because you're trying to hear something else, typically. Lean into something that at that moment is more important and you need to hear more instruction. So you need to pause that so that you can hear something else. In your life, when was the last time you pressed pause so that you could hear what he's trying to say to you? What he's trying to say to your family, for your life. See, that's why God has a Sabbath for us. We all need rest and we all need to hear from him. See, some people are really good at taking a day off from work. You'll take a day off from work and you'll go to the beach, or you'll go to the lake, or you'll go camping, hunting, or fishing, or you might go visit a family member, you might go hike a trail, and all of those things are good. That's great. Nothing wrong with those things, because we work hard and we play harder, but that's really not Sabbath rest. Okay? It's not pressing pause. There are others who go to a church service. Then they go to a Bible study. They listen to another sermon podcast. They might watch another church service online. But hear me, those are great things, and certainly nothing wrong with any of those things. But I really don't believe that they qualify as true Sabbath rest. They may be a part of it. Follow me, stay with me, but they're not totally all of it. Just stay with me. See, God gave us his plan and set us an example to follow. I'm going to go back to Genesis chapter 2. Verse 1 says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. Was God tired? Look, this isn't about God being tired. He created the universe in 6 days, and then he rested. All he had to do was speak. He wasn't tired, but he put in place for us a fundamental idea that we work 6 days and rest on the seventh. The Sabbath idea is a day of rest, but it's a day to focus on him and enjoy him. Listen to what he has to say in Exodus chapter 20 and verses 8 through 11. I won't read all of it, but let me lift some of it out. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made, I'm dropping down to verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. See, there's something to this thing about rest. Okay, look over in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. This should be a very familiar verse to some of you because we went through an incredible sermon series based on this verse last year. Come to me, Talking about Jesus. Jesus is speaking here. Come to me, Jesus, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I, Jesus, will give you rest. This is what I think God wants for us to hear today. The Sabbath is about pressing pause so that we can block out all the distractions and rest in His presence and worship Him. That is Sabbath rest. And we get really close to it sometimes. But then distractions happen because we just don't really know how to fully engage that pause button. We just can't fully let go of everything. We just can't leave this in another room. We just can't let go of the emails. We just can't let go of social media. I just can't say no to some of the kids' activities. I want them to be involved in everything. It's okay to have them involved in some things, but Mom, Dad, let me encourage you a little bit. They will be perfectly fine if they're not involved in 55 different things. A matter of fact, they'll be much better off if they're involved in about 5 or 6 things and Mom and Dad Sabbaths and disciples them helpfully. Didn't know, that's not in my notes, that's just free. I'm not suggesting that it always has to be alone. There's nothing wrong with Sabbathing with a spouse or your family, but I do believe there are times that we do need to press pause on all of it and simply be alone with Him. It's not a day at the lake. It's not even necessarily an hour at church. It's resting in His presence. You say, well, I can't do that. I got too many emails to answer. I just can't shut things down and stop. Well, you better learn how to, because it's His plan, not mine. So again, I go back to the words of Jesus. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Husbands, it may be really good for you to take a day off, to take the kids somewhere for the day, and let your wife Sabbath and allow her to hear Him speak into her life. Wives, it might be a really good idea for you to let Him take a day off from that to-do list and let Him get away somewhere and just spend some time in His presence and press pause on everything else so that He can be a better spiritual leader of the household, a better husband, a better dad. And for you single moms and dads, I didn't forget you. I know you don't have somebody necessarily that you could just leave the kids with. You know what? That's why you have a church family. That's why you have a life group. That's why we're here. That's why you have a church family to lean into and just say, you know what, guys? I need a Sabbath. I need to hear from God. I need some answers. Can somebody help? Anybody worth their salt here is not going to say no to that. Now, if you're taking advantage of it, that's a different story. You better hear from God. Look, maybe you're thinking, it sounds too good to be true. Well, look, verse 28, when Jesus said, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, this is the main point of the sermon. This is what I want you to take home tonight, if nothing else. When Jesus says this, He's saying, I am the Sabbath. Ultimate rest is found in Jesus, and the Sabbath is meant to point us to Christ and the rest that He brings. Now let's be real for a minute. Some of you here can't rest in Him simply because you're not in Him. It's been a while since you found rest. Some of you, you're not resting because you're exhausting all your efforts and everything under the sun trying to find rest. You're trying to find rest in pills, a bottle, failed relationship after failed relationship after failed relationship. Some of you, it's on a screen. Some of you, it's through other substances. Some of you, it's through your job. You're just work, and you just can't find what you're looking for. You can't find the rest that you're looking for. Can I introduce you to him tonight? We just referred to him as Sabbath, but his name is Jesus. And he wants a relationship with you. This one that the Pharisees and the whole Sanhedrin here was trying to kill and eventually did, they did nail him to a cross, and he did that willingly for us so that you and I could have a relationship with him. And by the way, he didn't stay dead. That's why so many people earlier when we were singing was doing this, because he didn't stay dead. No, he got up. That's why we're excited about an Easter service in a couple of weeks. We're really going to celebrate and rock the house because Jesus is alive. And it doesn't make sense to you, but if you ever get into a relationship with him, you'll understand why we get a little excited. And right now, if you feel your heart thumping, that's him knocking. And he's saying, I'm here to give you rest. All you got to do is let me in. Just say yes. For me, it was on June the 7th, 1986. I know I don't look that old, but it's okay. June the 7th, 1986, I felt him knocking. And I couldn't say no any longer. And I let him in. And I just simply prayed a simple prayer of faith. I knew that Jesus loved me enough that he came to this earth and died on the cross for my sins. I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn it. There was no way I would ever be able to earn it. But he loved me enough that he said, I will go and I will die for his sins. And all I had to do was put my faith in him and in him alone to save me. And when I prayed and told him I was sorry for all the wrong that I had done, and told him that the best way I knew how, by faith, I was inviting him into my life to save me, you know what happened? I felt rest. I felt peace. And for some of you that's been searching for so long, I invite you, find rest. Every head bowed, every eye closed, please, for just a moment. Nobody's looking right now. But if you're that person tonight that's here searching for rest, look, you're not doing this for me. Please know that. I just want to invite you for your sake, for your rest, for your eternity's sake. I want to invite you into a relationship with Jesus tonight. If you want Jesus to be your Savior and you need help praying a prayer, just follow behind me with something like this. Dear Jesus, I know I've done wrong and I'm so sorry. I'm asking you to forgive me. And the best way I know how, I'm putting my faith in you and in you alone right now to be my Savior. I believe that you died for my sins and rose from the dead, and I want heaven to be my home one day when I die.